In this episode, we're going to explore the fascinating evolution of the batting helmet in baseball. From its crude early designs to today's high-tech protective gear, we're going to uncover how we started using headgear and some of the innovations that have revolutionized player safety and performance for America's pastime. Today on Rounders, a history of baseball in America. Hey, baseball fans. Welcome to Rounders, your baseball history podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Lambert. Get ready to step into the time machine with us, and we're not just talking stats and scores. We're digging into the heart and soul of the players, teams, and countries that have made this a global sport. From the underdog stories to those jaw-dropping moments, Rounders is your front seat to the epic journey of baseball. So grab a seat in the digital bleachers, relax, and let's swing for the fences together. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's show. I am your host, Jeff Lambert. It's great to be back with you. It's been a while since we've had a new episode come out. Very excited to go through today's topic, which has been on my list for quite some time, and I've been wanting to get to it. So much information that had to be researched to be able to really dive deep into this topic. And I think it's one of those things that shows how baseball is so closely infused with American culture in terms of the time it takes for us to adopt things, to take progressive stances on certain things, such as player safety, which seems like it's more important today than it's ever been, but it's been a long road for that. So we're going to start with the baseball helmet today, but this is part of a series that I've been wanting to make a regular part of the show for some time. And I'm simply thinking of entitling all these episodes Baseball Innovations. And so each episode that I do, starting with this one, it's going to delve into certain innovations that happened in the sport that led to some sort of groundbreaking achievement that advanced the game of baseball. So in this episode, we're going to focus on the batting helmet, obviously a crucial piece of equipment that has undergone significant changes over the past 100 years. So we're going to start off by talking about its humble beginnings, which was a crude protective earmuff. And we're going to go all the way to talking about today's high-tech carbon fiber helmets. And we're going to highlight how far baseball has come in terms of prioritizing player safety when it comes to headgear. We'll also take time to explore the problems that led to the desire for change and advancement in this area, the different stages of player helmets and what was used, and of course, finish off by talking about today's version of where we're at with headgear. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started. We're going to go back to the 1800s to start our story. So what did headgear look like when baseball was in its early stages? So there wasn't really any specific head protection that has been documented for us to examine from the mid-1850s onward. Baseball players were largely unprotected when it came to head injuries. And the evolution of this idea of protecting one's cranium was a gradual process that didn't really pick up steam until there were several serious injuries that occurred combined with American innovation, I think, to start coming up with a solution for this. So we don't start to see head protection really become a topic of conversation until the beginning of the 20th century. So we get out of those first 40 to 50 years of baseball, we get into the early 1900s, and then we see some starts of head protection start popping up in terms of players wanting to do this or inventors trying to come up with a solution for a growing problem. And there's probably some factors that led to baseball leagues to start the conversation about looking into headgear. One of those would be the influence of football on other sports in America. So from a very early time, we see football prioritize pretty quickly off the bat something to be able to protect the head. So they started off by using leather helmets. This was one of the first, I think, spurrings in the early 1900s for baseball to also start thinking about what can we do to protect players' heads as these incidents arise. And another motivator, which we're going to talk about more in a minute, is the increasing frequency of serious head injuries to players. So we see more and more as pitching becomes more tied into velocity and speed, as we see the evolution of the pitching position in general, going from something that's, underhanded or not a priority when it came to the 9 men on the field, become its own weapon that teams could use to be able to win games. As we see that transformation, we start to see, unfortunately, more and more players getting hurt by these new types of pitches being thrown, by some of the cheating that's going on in terms of being able to disguise the ball to get strikes. And as pitchers treating the position as something to take seriously, to be able to throw with more velocity, to be able to become really dominant at that position. And the downside of that was players started getting hit in the head more because of it. So those two things I think we could say in baseball's first 50 to 75 years really spurred this beginning desire to check out, what should we do to protect people's heads a little bit more effectively. So if we understand that, we're in the early 1900s, baseball's first head protection apparatus came about thanks to an inventor named Frank Mogridge. So he's credited for creating the first patent for a head protector in 1905, and he named it aptly the pneumatic head protector. So this early form of a batting helmet was shaped like an oven mitt, okay? And imagine an oven mitt wrapped around the back of your head, where it would go around and it would cover your ears, but not the top of your head. And the way it would work is you would put that on and you would blow through a tube to be able to inflate this through a rubber tube. So the end result was basically this product looked like a fluffy pair of earmuffs or an inflatable boxing glove that protected where the ball usually was striking players, which is right around the side of the face, the ear, as the side of the face is facing towards the pitcher. So Mogridge's invention, it marked one of the earliest efforts to introduce protective headgear into baseball. And even though this was an innovative design, it was new to the public and to the players as something to consider, the helmet didn't catch on. It was not widely used. Some isolated examples of people trying it out, but it did not gain much traction. And that could be to various factors. Could be player comfort. It doesn't look comfortable to be able to wear. The effectiveness of the protection it offered, even though it covered the ear effectively, the whole top of the head was still exposed. So if you still have a high pitch that's going to hit you above the ear, there's not much this is going to be able to do that, if it's more towards the top of your head. But another thing that we go back to, and we're going to talk about this, intermittently during the episode, there's a resistance to change, I think, with anything in American sports. Even though baseball overall has been a very progressive sport, I think, there was initial pushback on, we don't need this. This is not something that's true to the core of what the sport, the manliness that's required to play it and how we protect ourselves. And why do I need this? And so there's that pushback. There's that attitude of, we don't need this. That's still very, very prevalent during this time. But nevertheless, we see a groundbreaking step forward, and that's Mogridge's inflatable earmuffs, if you will, as that first example of a head protector in baseball. So if you fast forward with me, we have another example at the beginning of the 1900s of inventors exploring with head protection. And the next person we're going to go to is a guy named A.J. Reach. So A.J. Reach was actually a former baseball player. He was the eventual founder of the Philadelphia Phillies franchise. He started a sporting goods operation in 1874, a store. And that store eventually evolved into a larger factory, which was founded and named the A.J. Reach Company. And in addition to selling products, as they built their factory, this business got involved in expanding to manufacture baseballs for professional leagues. They also got involved in manufacturing footballs and boxing gloves. So Reach's company developed a prototype batting helmet in the early 1900s, which was patented and advertised to the public by the same year that Mogridge's invention came out in 1905. But this helmet, just like the one that we talked about before, never really caught on. It didn't receive widespread usage. And unfortunately, we have documentation of this product being sold, but there's no images that I could find going through microfiche files and historic files of what that product actually looked like from the A.J. Reach Company. But we can assume that it was probably similar to other products that his company sold, and they certainly did sell leather helmets for football. So I would assume, I think, I'm taking a little bit of a reach here, that it probably resembled what was being sold for football helmets during this time. So we have two examples here of early inventions for headgear for baseball. Then we have players, which is a huge step forward, start to adopt an attitude of, this might be a good idea. And the first example of a player using a helmet in a way that it became visible to the public, actually using it in a public game, was a guy named Roger Bresnahan. So Roger Bresnahan is a Hall of Fame catcher, and he played for multiple pro teams at the beginning of the 1900s. And he significantly contributed to steps forward in the acceptance of headgear in baseball. So we jump back to 1907. We're about 2 years after we see these 2 patents filed for these 2 products for headgear. And Bresnahan, during a game, was knocked unconscious by a pitch. And he didn't wake up shortly after it occurred. He was carried off in a stretcher. He was taken to a hospital, still didn't wake up. It was to the point where there was a concern that he wasn't going to wake up at all. And the hospital actually called a Catholic priest to come read him his last rites. But he did end up coming around, and he spent the next 10 days in the hospital. And during that time, he toyed with schematics for head protection and thinking about what just happened to him and how he might be able to prevent it from happening in the future. So fast forward with me 1 month later, he returns to a game, and he stepped up to the plate wearing Frank Mogridge's earmuffs as a head protector during a live game. So Bresnahan was a respected guy. He was a respected player. He was a household name, certainly amongst fans of the teams that he played for. And him wearing this in public was a huge step forward because it familiarized players and fans with the idea of wearing headgear on the field. Now, Bresnahan was really a pioneer in this area. He also introduced shin guards for catchers to wear in 1907, that same year. Now, he denied later on that he invented shin guards. He's often credited with that. But he stated that he was just a guy that adopted it for baseball, and he got the idea from watching cricket players in their equipment. So he was a pioneer in this area. We see him with the shin guards. Also the first guy to wear a batting helmet on field for others to see and start thinking about, hey, maybe this is a good idea. But overall, wrapping up this first segment, from baseball's early history till about 1915, player headgear really can't be seen as more than an experiment in professional baseball. And it would take some drastic events coupled with the power of mass media to make it a big deal to people nationwide to push for headgear adoption on a large-scale basis. So let's move into the second section of our episode, which is talking about what were some of those tragedies and events that really pushed professional baseball, and fans and other stakeholders in the sport really push for better headgear to protect players. So just like any major innovation, I think a lot of times it takes a tragedy or a major event to force stubborn humans to change. And baseball's traditionalists really fought tooth and nail against the adoption of headgear. The same thing happened in other sports, though. It's not unique to this sport. Hockey went through a very long period, even longer than baseball, of resisting the idea of wearing protective headgear. Sports leagues as a whole, I don't think are usually hotbeds for a progressive change. I think baseball does better than most. But what we see overall is there had to be some big events that took place that opened the door for stronger headgear protection measures. So let's talk about some of those. The first one we're going to profile is the death of Ray Chapman. So on August 16th, 1920, right? So Bresnahan in 1907, just to call it back, wore for the first time a protective headgear piece on the field. Great. We're fast forwarding to 1920. You've got Ray Chapman. He's a shortstop for the Cleveland Indians, and he was hit in the head by a pitch that was thrown by Yankees reliever Carl Mays. Now, the sound of the ball striking Chapman's skull that game was so loud that the pitcher, Carl Mays, thought it had hit the end of Chapman's bat. And he even ran up towards home plate to field the ball and throw it to first before he realized something was wrong. Chapman was able to stand very briefly, mumbled some words, collapsed on the field. He was taken to a nearby hospital, but he died 12 hours later. And Ray Chapman was a popular player at the time of his death. In fact, he had led the American League in runs scored and walks just 2 seasons earlier in 1918. He was a top-notch bunter. He's still 6th all-time for sacrifice hits, with 67 in a single season. And he was hitting .303 that season, with 97 runs scored when he died. So this wasn't an obscure name that suffered this fate. This was someone that most baseball fans knew well. So thousands of mourners showed up for Ray Chapman's funeral. Cleveland players, obviously in complete sadness over what had occurred, decided to wear black armbands for the remainder of the season. And some members of the media, for the first time, as we see the mass media apparatus expand, we see them speak out for the first time, saying in a stronger way that we need more protection for our players, more protective equipment. Let me give you some examples of that. So the Spalding Baseball Guide, we've all heard of Spalding for equipment. They had a guide that was very popular during this time. It was in operation from 1889 until 1939. They published an article after Chapman's death that said, quote, "A head helmet for the batter is not to be despised," end quote. And they published that article shortly after Chapman's death. Some other examples. The secretary of the New York Giants, Frank McQuaid, reportedly after Chapman's death, met with other National League executives for a closed-door meeting where they discussed pushing for mandated batting helmet use for the first time. It didn't happen, but we have Major League executives, National League executives, talking about this, openly about this for the first time. The following season in 1921, we saw the first known case of a manager for a professional team providing head protection for their players. And that milestone came about thanks to the Philadelphia Phillies. Their manager, Pat Morin, issued cork-cushioned hats to all of his players. But for the most part, they were deemed unpopular and they were rarely used. But that's certainly a step forward in terms of trying to offer some sort of protection for players. Then we have the legendary Connie Mack, manager for the Philadelphia Athletics at this time. He went on record the following season in a 1921 interview, and he said that he supported protective headgear for players. So these are major steps forward in an outcry for more protection. And this is something that really pushed things forward, unfortunately, with Ray Chapman's death. And we didn't see any widespread adoption of headgear after his unfortunate demise, but it did get the public more attuned to considering that need for more player protection during the games. Let's go to another tragic incident that happened in 1937 with a player named Mickey Cochran. So we're jumping 17 years in the future. Progress goes slowly in baseball. Mickey Cochran, a future Hall of Fame catcher for the Detroit Tigers, during a game that season was hit in the head by a pitch from Yankees pitcher Bump Hadley, another Yankees pitcher, right? This happened right after Cochran had hit a home run in his previous at-bat. And that pitch struck Cochran squarely on the head. Boom. And the impact was so bad it broke his skull. He was immediately carried off the field and hospitalized, and he remained unconscious for over a week. The injury was so severe that it nearly cost him his life. And although he eventually recovered from this hit, his playing career ended the moment that ball hit his head. He never played another game on advice of his doctors, and just he wasn't able to do it physically. So this incident, again, picked up by the media, calls from other players and managers and fans that there was a wider call for player protection, especially when it came to head protection. Mickey Cochran himself came out after the injury, after he had recovered, and said that players should, quote, absolutely be required to wear protective helmets. And just 1 week after Cochran's injury, the Cleveland Indians and the Philadelphia Athletics decided to try something that we see for the first time. They got leather and polo helmets that were used from other sports and had their players wear them during batting practice as a test run of sorts for in-game use. Now, there's no evidence that they actually used those during an actual live regular season game. But just the fact that they used them, just the fact that they tried them out and had players wear them during batting practice is another big step forward. Let's go to 1940. 3 seasons later, we see another major incident happen. This is a string of things, but the 1940 Brooklyn Dodgers really helped push even further into this demand for better headgear protection. There were 2 serious injuries that happened during that season, during the 1940 season, and it pushed Major League Baseball overall towards the edge to really think about mandating head protection. The first thing that happened that season was future Hall of Famer Pee Wee Reese, and he was a 21-year-old shortstop when this happened, just a kid. He was hit by a pitch from Chicago Cubs right-hander Jake Moody. He had to spend 2 weeks in the hospital because of that. Then that same season, Anaheim All-Star Joe Medwick, who had recently been acquired from the Cardinals to the Dodgers, was beamed on the head by a Cardinals pitcher, Bob Bowen. So Joe wasn't the same for the rest of the season. He eventually recovered too, but he stated on multiple occasions that he was plagued by double vision after the incident, and we saw his stats drop off significantly after that injury. So those two events led the Dodgers front office, starting with general manager Larry McPhail, to decide to take action to protect the team's investments. It makes sense. So during that 1940 season, the team came to a decision that for the following season, in 1941, all Dodgers players had to wear protective helmets. And they also stated that mandated headgear would provide players with, quote, skull insurance. That was their public statement on why they were doing this. So this decision marked the first time that a major league team mandated the use of protective headgear. Huge step forward, right? Now, just a quick note. Were the Dodgers the first professional baseball team to require headgear? They actually weren't. They were the first major league team to do it. But that accolade actually goes to a professional baseball club from the Western League, which was a competing league during this time. And the team that did it was called the Des Moines Demons. Excuse me. I don't know why that came out so hard. They had made a rule that all players had to wear batting helmets 2 years earlier. So we see progress. The decision only lasted for one game for them, but they were the first team to technically do it. And it broke that barrier. That's the most important thing of just having it out in public and people seeing that batting helmets were mandated. This is something we're going to do to protect our players. We have one more major event that really helped push things even further forward in terms of headgear adoption, and that was a guy named Joe Adcock. So fast forward again with me to 1954. We're going from 1940 to 1954. We're seeing other teams slowly adopt mandated batting helmet policies. Joe Adcock is a first baseman for the Milwaukee Braves, and he showed to everybody watching the life-saving potential of a batting helmet. So during a game against the Brooklyn Dodgers, it's so funny how we see these little threads come together, right? We saw 2 players seriously injured. One died from Yankees pitches that were thrown in, and then we see the Dodgers involved in helping mandate headgear, and here we have this big moment of showing the effectiveness of headgear, again, with the Brooklyn Dodgers involved. Sorry, just quick aside. I love how those things come together sometimes. But we have a game. It's the Braves against the Dodgers. Joe Adcock, first baseman for the Braves. He's up to bat. He's hit on the head by a pitch from Dodgers pitcher Clem Labine. Now, the pitch struck Adcock just over the left ear. And remember, early batting helmets did not have that ear flap that we see now. So the ear is exposed. That impact from that pitch was so severe that it cracked the plastic batting helmet that Adcock was wearing. He was wearing it voluntarily because his team didn't require it, but people in the press box stated afterwards that they heard the crack, the impact of the pitch hitting that helmet. So Adcock was bleeding from the ear because it did hit his ear, and he went down and he was carried off the field in the stretcher, had to go to the hospital to be checked. But he was okay. He was actually in the lineup the next day for the next game for the Braves. And this showed to everybody, wow, look at the difference between what happened to guys like Ray Chapman compared to guys like Joe Adcock, who actually wore a helmet and was hit in the head. And this is the first public display, I think, of the saving potential of protective headgear. So Adcock's survival was largely attributed by his doctors to the fact that he was wearing that helmet, that it protected him from fatal injury. So after this event, we saw more players voluntarily wearing helmets. We saw more teams surging in their interest in plastic protective caps. And this, again, played a significant role in the widespread adoption and mandating of batting helmets in the sport. In the early 1950s, the governing body of Little League Baseball decided to mandate the use of protective headgear during all games for players. So we see that occur. We saw the International League back in 1939 be the first league to be able to roll out protective headgear requirements for players. So it's not just the teams now. I think the American and National League are feeling the pressure ramp up more and more. And finally, in 1956, the National League officially passed a rule requiring protective headgear for players on all teams. The American League followed suit. They passed a similar rule just before the start of the 1958 season. So about a season and a half later, we see both leagues end up adopting this rule. And look, at first, just like anything, I think, this was more of a gentleman's rule that they passed. It's mandatory with air quotes. And they added some little rules that worked in favor of like, let's just try and get this moving in the right direction. It was a gentleman's agreement, if you will. So players that chose to not wear a helmet, if they came out of the dugout and went up to bat and they weren't wearing one, there was usually little to no enforcement of that. There was actually a clause in the requirement by both the National and American leagues that veteran players were allowed to make a decision on whether they wanted to wear a helmet or not. They were considered grandfathered into this rule if they played before it was passed. And that lasted up until 1970. And then we see Major League Baseball take an additional step and say, okay, even though we treated this as more of a guideline, we grandfathered people in, they decided to crack down and said absolutely no players can come to bat without headgear, protective headgear on. So the last Major League player to bat helmetless was Bob Montgomery, who last played for the Boston Red Sox in 1979. That's when he retired. But 1970 was the first time we see just flat enforcement across the board. And we finally see that headgear had arrived. It was required for all players, and that protection became paramount. So what evolutions has the batting helmet gone through since the 1970s and its requirement for all players to wear one? Well, we see some examples. So in 1983, that was the first time we saw the ear flap make its debut on batting helmets. They made that ear flap mandatory. At least one side of the helmet had to have one. And this was obviously to provide that additional protection to the side of the head that was facing the pitcher. Because if it's a lower pitch, it can hit the cheekbone, it can hit the ear. The ear flap helped with that. Major innovation and step forward. In 2006, Rawlings unveiled for the first time, this was a big deal, especially I think for players that had to wear it, something called the Cool Flow helmet. And what this was, it created vents in the batting helmet to improve air circulation and to keep players cool. So ventilation being a standard feature in batting helmets didn't even happen until 2006. It was really dependent on what you bought. We also see that the official helmet of the MLB has also gone through changes. If we look at a helmet now, it's not just made from plastic. It's actually produced from aerospace grade carbon fiber, which is 130 times stronger than the ABS plastic that was used for several decades by MLB teams. So that's a huge step forward. We also see more and more the usage of something called the C-flap on modern baseball helmets. So imagine this is a piece of plastic that extends down the ear flap to protect the jaw of the side of the head that's facing the pitcher. So the league does specify, in addition to these things that have been added to the helmet over the years, that any modification or addition or removal of parts of the helmet that could compromise its overall integrity is strictly prohibited. It has to be something that's centrally accepted in order to be used by teams. There can't be different, new features being added to helmets without that review. So we've reached a point where Major League Baseball has now centralized the governance and oversight of head protection, where we saw the inverse when, we saw teams and players voluntarily deciding what they wanted to use for head protection. So we've come full circle to a point where I think baseball has shown that they've finally prioritized player safety. And we see that headgear has obviously prevented many deaths, many serious injuries, because it is now something that we expect players to do. And that's a huge difference from when we started. So these modifications, they've helped improve that overall safety. They've made batting helmets more comfortable. We came a long way from the earmuff that went around the back of the head. And there's a commitment there now that we see that player safety is important. And baseball should be commended for that, even if it took them as long as it did to go through these adoptions. Folks, that does it for today. Thank you for joining me for this episode. It's been great to go through some of these innovations. I hope you enjoyed looking at something as possibly mundane as the batting helmet and really thinking about how it got to the point that it is today. Remember, if you haven't already, please take a moment, recommend this episode or this show to a friend who likes baseball. The best way to be able to help grow this show is just to share it with other people, and that means a lot to me if you do. So thanks again for joining me, and remember, there are only two seasons, winter and baseball. See you next time. Thanks for joining us for this episode as we explored another amazing moment from baseball history. You can help grow the show by liking us on YouTube and your podcast app of choice. Don't forget to head on over and sign up for the free email newsletter and the bonus show, This Week in Baseball History. Just go to www.rounders.substack.com. A special thanks to our premium subscribers that are helping us grow for just $1.25 a week, and to our starting 9 supporters, Nathan Halverson and Jack Wilson. You are the producers helping make this the top baseball history show out there. See you next week, and remember, there are only two seasons, winter and baseball.